Welcome back to the Psychedelic Podcast by Third Wave, connecting you to the leaders and pioneers of the psychedelic renaissance. This is your host, Paul F. Austin, and today's episode is a bonus episode. It's a keynote from our inaugural event in the Psychedelic Horizons event series, a keynote that I gave around going beyond resilience, inspired living, and systems change. We invited entrepreneurs, investors, practitioners, those who are looking to transition into a career in the psychedelic space for an evening of discussion connection as we explored the convergence of psychedelics, global systems, and entrepreneurship. And with psychedelics on the verge of legalization, people around the world are waking up to their deepest potential and purpose. We live in an explosion of visionary creativity and human potential never seen in history. How can we best channel this creative energy towards a future beyond resilience, rooted in the mycelial wisdom of decentralization and collaboration? Conscious entrepreneurship offers a powerful vehicle to benefit clients and customers and drive systemic change itself. This is a live keynote. It's about a 25 to 30 minute talk. We also have two more events coming up, June 5th in Mill Valley in the San Francisco Bay Area, and on June 10th in Malibu. If you're interested in attending either of those events, come to our page, send us an email. There will also be links in the show notes. You can just go to this bonus episode on the website and you can get your tickets there. We have 50 tickets available for each event. So without further ado, here is the bonus episode, and I do hope you enjoy it.
Give a big, energizing, and warm welcome to Paul Austin.
Thank you. Thank you, Pablo. How are y'all doing? Magical. Right? Everything about this is magical. It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to facilitate with Pablo. Let's give it up for Pablo, by the way, for everything he's done and he's doing. And when we were ideating about the intention of the evening, this phrase, Psychedelic Horizons, felt very, very relevant, very prominent. We're sitting at a moment in time where the FDA is on the verge of approving MDMA for PTSD. Oregon and Colorado have legalized psychedelic plant medicines, and over, I think, 60% of Americans now support legal psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. And for those who have been around the space for some time, there's a deep understanding that the work is just beginning, right? And so the intention of coming together tonight is to explore how do we craft a resilient future, specifically through conscious entrepreneurship. How many of you are entrepreneurs in some way, shape, or form? I mean, imagine the vast majority of you. How many of you have had your lives dramatically impacted by psychedelics in a positive way? Great. So I'm speaking to the right crowd. It's fantastic. So my story starts at the age of 16. I grew up in a pretty traditional environment in a little suburb of Grand Rapids called Grandville. And everything was quite grand if you were religious and followed the rules and did what you were supposed to do. And as you can imagine, I didn't qualify for that. And at the age of 16, my parents found out that I had been smoking cannabis, that I had been experimenting with cannabis. And they sat me down one Sunday after church. And my dad looked at me, and I have a very close relationship with my parents, a very loving relationship with my parents. But my dad looked at me and he said, I haven't been this disappointed since my brother passed away in a car accident 30 years ago. Right? And so imagine, I'm a 16-year-old kid. I just had a really fun experience with cannabis. It was really interesting. And here I am being told that this experience is something to be ashamed of. It's something to be guilty of. And I was traumatized from that experience. It was really hard to swallow that. And yet at the same time, I knew that experience that I'd had with cannabis was insightful. It was illuminating. It was interesting. There was something there that I wanted to go deeper into. And so a few years later, at the age of 19, I had the opportunity to work with psychedelics. First psilocybin mushrooms and then LSD. And it was a beautiful May day when I had my first really mystical and magical experience with LSD in the woods of West Michigan. And the deep feeling was one of incredible reverence, respect, and love for the natural environment, right? For nature, and all of her beauty and glory and awe. There was a deep sense that I was her, she was me. There was no disconnection. There was no separation between myself and the world that we live in, the natural environment that we live in. And so from that experience, the teaching of the lesson was one of connection, but also freedom and sovereignty more than anything. And what I came away from that experience with a deep devotion to was, if I could spend my time and energy on one thing, it would be to help restore our right relationship with nature, right? And that if we could open up sort of the aperture of our consciousness to connect with nature in a deep way. And look, I'm wearing a suit jacket. I don't really identify as a hippie in any stretch of the imagination. And yeah, I had these deep desire to take care of the natural environment. And so for the topic of the night, crafting resilient futures, what I mentioned in the description is I talked about three things. Resilience, and we'll even say beyond resilience. What is beyond resilience? The sort of intellectual phrase is anti-fragility, but no one knows what the fuck that is, so I left that out. So beyond resilience, how do we go beyond resilience? Inspired living, what inspires us to pursue our dharma, to pursue our path, to really follow the sort of voice inside of us that is on a mission of devotion, of commitment, of purpose. And then the final one is systemic change, right? When we're looking at the systems that we exist within, how is it that we can change those systems? How is it that we can impact those systems? So a few years after I did LSD, I was again doing LSD in Budapest. I was 24 and with a couple friends. And this was 2015. And Clayton, who's in the back, Clayton, raise your hand. Clayton and I were hanging out in Budapest at that point in time. Had a ton of fun. And one of those experiences, in that experience, I was inspired to take that initial knowledge that had been sort of opened up at the age of 19 and actually start to integrate it into my professional vocation and my professional path. And that's where the third wave came from. Right? And the idea of the third wave of psychedelics is that our relationship with psychedelics is nothing new. That we've had a deep relationship with these medicines for thousands of years. And that in coming out of that relationship, there seems to be a deep harm or a deep challenge that we are confronted with. And so if we can help to reestablish, again, like indigenous and ancient communities have done for thousands of years, reestablish our relationship to nature using psychedelics, then that might offer a glimpse of a future that is more beautiful, that we want to live in. Right? So the idea with the third wave of psychedelics is it had been around for thousands of years. We had attempted to bring it back into our consciousness in the second wave of psychedelics, the 50s and 60s. We'd failed, but we had failed falling forward, which is a sort of cliche entrepreneurial phrase. Right? You fail falling forward. So we had failed as a culture falling forward. And now, in 2024, there's all of a sudden an opportunity to right that ship and to root a lot of our understanding of these medicines in wisdom. In preparing for this talk, I was reading through a number of quotes, and one that stuck out to me in particular was from E.O. Wilson. How many of you have heard of E.O. Wilson? A few of you. So E.O., one of his favorite quotes is that we are overwhelmed with information and starving for wisdom. And that the synthesizers of information, those who can discern between what is true and what is not, what is the signal compared to what is the noise, these individuals will help to communicate a way forward. E.O. Wilson also said that we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And so in the face of AI and artificial intelligence, in the face of this rapid acceleration of technology, there's this synchronicity or this intuitive way in which psychedelics are re-entering our consciousness to teach us the importance of slowing down and being with. So this third wave of psychedelics is really about the middle way. How do we find that middle way between the ancient and indigenous use and the more modern cutting edge science and objectivity and these sorts of things? So when we look at the scientific evidence of psychedelics for going beyond resilience, one of the, I would say, most well-established effects of psychedelics is their impact on neuroplasticity. They catalyze BDNF production, brain-derived neurotropic factor, which is a precursor to neuroplasticity. They make behavioral change way easier. We all experience this in the afterglow of a high-dose therapeutic experience. We probably experience this when we microdose. It keeps up in that critical learning period for even longer. And so when we look at becoming anti-fragile, going beyond resilience, a key aspect of that is adaptability. How do we adapt? As the external world gets faster, how do we adapt? How do we slow down? How do we go internal? The second aspect, inspired living. The ancient Greeks had this phrase that to die before you die means that you don't die when you die. I'll say that again. To die before you die means you don't die when you die. And this was inscripted in the temples and the halls where they participated in the Eleusinian mysteries, where they drank kukion, a beverage that was made of ergot, the same thing that LSD is made from. And so the wisdom in psychedelics, especially at these high-dose therapeutic experiences, is that I am not I. I am not only I. I am I, but I'm way beyond just the I. And that understanding, that deep knowledge that death is an illusion, often allows for a more inspired way to live. There's a courage that is opened up, where we can no longer ignore the Dharma that we have been brought here to follow. And so that courage, an inspired way of living, is what, all of you, so many of you, it's the reason you're here tonight. It's why you've been so impacted by psychedelics. And many of you already are on that path, or you're seeking that path of what wants to emerge, what wants to come through. Where does this wisdom want to guide me? And the third one, systems change, systemic change. Ken Wilber, how many of you have heard of Ken Wilber? You know of Ken Wilber, philosopher who has written extensively. He wrote a book called The Religion of Tomorrow in 2016. And in that book, he outlined this pathway that we were following as a culture of spirituality and how spirituality will transform our systems, according to him. And the reference that he made, the parallel that he drew, was with the printing press and the Renaissance, that when the printing press came out in the mid-15th century, it catalyzed an intellectual movement of literacy. And it wasn't that everyone immediately learned how to read and write. It took many centuries for that to happen. But that about 10% of people in the Renaissance developed the capacity to read and write because of the invention of the printing press. And they went on to develop the whole entire university system to be merchants, to develop the industrial system as we know it today, which has then created, today, 99, 100% of people are literate in Western countries. What if psychedelics did that for consciousness the way the printing press did that for literacy? And it's not that everyone has to have this mystical experience, this sense of ego death that would probably be more harmful than helpful. In fact, Terence McKenna was speaking at Esalen in the 80s, and Ralph Metzner. Ralph was an OG psychologist who was friends with Timothy Leary and Ram Dass in the 60s at Harvard. Ralph raised his hand and asked a question and said, do you think everyone needs to take psychedelics in order for culture itself to change? And Terence said, I don't think so. It's just the 5 to 10% of people who are hardcore psychonauts. They need to do the work. They need to be devoted to exploring the inner antipodes of their consciousness. And in doing that work, in developing, thank you, John. In developing that internal landscape, that richness that comes from the inner knowing, the inner depth, that creates a space to understand how can we build new systems that are rooted in what I call the truth of interconnectedness. That we can no longer accept that we are separate from the thing outside of us, that we are entangled with it, that we are deeply connected to it. So beyond resilience, adaptability, inspired living, courage, ego dissolution, and systems change. Right? The hardcore psychonauts, and I'm looking at a lot of them in this room. How do we do that deep inner work so we can bring that magic out into the world around us in whatever way that looks, in whatever our path asks us to follow? Aldous Huxley, probably everyone here has heard of Aldous Huxley, best known for writing Brave New World in 1933, a dystopian novel. How many of you have read Brave New World? Okay, many of you. A dystopian novel in 1933, really criticizing what Huxley would call the onward march of the machine. It was a very critical take on where culture and society was at that point in time. That pessimism, as you can imagine, only was amplified and strengthened with World War II, when it broke out in 1939, and then from 1939 to 1945. And so Huxley, I would say the foremost intellectual of the 20th century, was left grasping for answers. He went through his own spiritual process. He studied Vedanta, non-duality. And in grasping for a sense of what is going on, the world is falling apart as we know it. And so many of us experience that today, and it's nothing like what was happening 70, 80 years ago. For him, it wasn't a matter of giving up. It wasn't a matter of saying the world is fucked, so forget about it. He continued to explore his own consciousness. And so in 1953, he was offered mescaline, which is typically in San Pedro peyote. He had this experience with psychedelic, wrote a book called The Doors of Perception, which is where the Doors get their name from. Soon after these psychedelic experiences, he wrote his final book called Island. And Island was the exact opposite of Brave New World. It was a novel, a story about a utopian society called Pala that was in the West Indies, an island that was isolated from the rest of the world and that was doing its best to maintain its isolation, to protect the purity of its culture. And he wrote that book as a blueprint, as a roadmap. It was his final gift before he died. He died in 1963, the same day as JFK and C.S. Lewis, in fact. And what's also a fun little fact is he had his wife inject him with LSD as he died, which is exactly what I want. So this was his final gift, right? And so you think in the face of World War II, right? This man who had been so pessimistic and cynical, why didn't he just give up? There was an awakening. There was a sense of anti-fragility. He was inspired through both Vedanta, but also his psychedelic work, to write one last book that would provide that blueprint that I think is very, very relevant for today. Because when we talk about system change, even when we're in this venue, this beautiful, incredible, amazing, magical, I mean, I could keep going with superlatives, venue, many of us have a friend or two or three or 10 who have talked about communal living, who have talked about going to Costa Rica, who have even set up a place maybe in Todos Santos, or British Columbia or Portugal. There's something in the water, not literally, but there's something in the water that seems to be inspiring a new way to think. Tim Ferriss is sort of the godfather of lifestyle design, individual lifestyle design. How can I experience as much freedom as possible? And we're at this precipice now where we're focusing more and more on collective lifestyle design. And so the polarity that I was talking through, Leanne and Vina, when we were preparing for this talk, is Elon Musk and this place called Brave Earth, where we do our intensives for our Practitioner Training Program. Elon Musk has a massive vision. He is mission focused. He's the wealthiest man in the world. He's incredibly controversial. Some would say also incredibly traumatized. But he cares deeply about his mission, to the point where the patent for Tesla, the battery, he didn't patent it. He said, I want this to be open source because the overall momentum of renewable cars is more important than just individual shareholder value. Massive vision. And he's found his role, he's found his dharma, right? He really cares about this regenerative movement. There's critiques, of course, and there's a lot of fucked up shit, but he cares deeply. Big vision. Brave Earth is a center in Costa Rica. It's 88 acres. They call it a living laboratory, a center for applied cultural transition. It's started by two brothers. It's local. There's no more than 27 people who are on the board, no more than 80 people who will live there. They grow all their own food. They do medicine work, deep medicine work with ayahuasca and psilocybin there. And the intention is to create a laboratory, a blueprint, much like Huxley's Island, for new ways in which we can live. There's not a big vision. It's very grounded. It's very localized. But the heart is still there. And so when we look at that polarity, my question is, one, where do you fall on that? Right? What resonates for you about those stories? And two, how do we develop systems that are contextual, that allow for everyone to follow this path of who they want to be, of where they want to go, influenced and informed by psychedelics? Okay, the final thing that I want to talk about is ayahuasca and AI. So ayahuasca versus AI, right? Ayahuasca is a rooting. How many of you have worked with ayahuasca at some point? Yeah, okay. The mother medicine, right? Deep medicine, healing medicine, ancient medicine. There's something that happens when we work with ayahuasca that puts us back in touch with this primordial sense of self, this archaic sense of self. It's very human, and it's also not at all, right? It's an intelligence. Just like artificial intelligence, it's an intelligence. It's a plant intelligence. It's an ancient intelligence. And that relationship, that symbiosis with ayahuasca as an intelligence has been so healing for so many. Artificial intelligence. There's a lot of concerns. There's a lot of fear. And yet we're here. It could be an ally if we choose to look at it as an ally. Ayahuasca is much more of a first wave intelligence. AI is much more of a fourth wave intelligence. And so what's the middle way? How do we maintain our humanness while still relying on these allies? Technology, godlike technology, right? Back to that E.O. Wilson quote. We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. How might ayahuasca, how might psychedelics help us to navigate that? Okay, final closing, and then we'll move into the panel. I mentioned the story, when I was 16, my dad looked at me, ashamed, couldn't believe it, incredibly disappointed. I cared, but not enough to stop what I was doing. Got into psychedelics, started Third Wave in 2015, started a legal psilocybin center in the Netherlands, Synthesis in 2018. And, just every now and then would send my parents things that were happening. My parents are, my dad's never been drunk. They definitely have never smoked weed, obviously. They're people who go to church every Sunday. They're teetotalers in many ways. Because I kept showing up, because I was following that path, and because of the trust and the love that I have with my dad, in 2018, I sent him Michael Pollan's book to read, How to Change Your Mind. And he started to microdose. And then in 2019, I was visiting my parents in Granville. And I guided my dad through a high-dose psilocybin journey. Basically the only time he's ever done any drug whatsoever. And it was meaningful. It wasn't life-changing, it was meaningful, it was impactful. And so when we talk about or think about systems change, when we as entrepreneurs think about vision and big picture, we often get caught in the big picture. And we forget that so much of transformation happens in the little moments. It happens in our family. It happens with our friends. It happens when we show up and we know without a shadow of a doubt that we are living the life that we are meant to live. When we are doing it with love, when we are doing it with purpose, when we are doing it with devotion, when we are doing it with commitment. And that heart is what transforms us as individuals. And I also trust that it's what will transform the systems that we live in. That heart, that loving, beating, beautiful, magical heart. Being with that. Settling into that, honoring that, will lead the path forward. Thank you.
Thanks so much for watching. For a deeper dive into the power of microdosing with complementary practice and extra guidance, check out our best-selling microdosing course. It's a science-based protocol with dozens of best practices so you can customize your protocol to your unique needs and goals. Check out the link in the description below.